Hey, what's up guys? I'm BTC. In this video, we're doing a countdown of the top 5 tips for Overwatch heroes. If you're new to Overwatch, or if you're having trouble climbing the competitive ladder, then this guide is for you. Starting at number 5, play all the heroes. The first thing I would tell anyone who just started playing the game is that you shouldn't focus on any one character. Now, of course, when people have a first look at the different characters in Overwatch, they're going to pick out a couple that they're interested in playing, but the biggest mistake is that they only play those characters. No one is going to be good at every single character, but it's important that you are familiar with every character. So when you first start out playing Overwatch, I suggest that you spend the first week or so playing all the different characters, so that you get a better understanding of what their abilities are, strengths and weaknesses, and a general idea of how each character works. Even though you're probably not going to play all the characters on a regular basis, you are still going to end up in matches where your opponents are playing those characters, and you need to know how to deal with those heroes. As a little extra bonus with playing all the characters, you may find yourself more interested in playing a character that you otherwise would have never tried. Number 4. The heroes you should be using. No game that has a large number of characters is ever going to be perfectly balanced, and Overwatch certainly is no exception. Now, I'm not going to go into any sort of complicated tier listing, but you should understand that some characters are very strong, some are average, and some are weak, or at best, situational. You also have to understand that some heroes are very good for lower skill brackets, but terrible in high skill brackets, and vice versa. Now, because this video is aimed at new players, beginners, and those having difficulty climbing the competitive ladder, here are a list of characters that I suggest you learn and practice with. If you want to play a damage role, I would suggest starting with Pharah, Reaper, Soldier 76, Roadhog, or Zarya. Now you might be saying, wait a minute here, Roadhog and Zarya as a damage role? That's something that I'll probably talk about more in another video, but suffice it to say that Roadhog and Zarya are not really tanks. They're basically high health DPS, which is a category also known as bruisers. Now, if you want to play an actual tank role, any of the remaining ones will work just fine. D.Va, Reinhardt, or Winston. As for the support categories, you should start with Lucio and Mercy, and as you get a little bit better and more familiar with the game, you can move on to Ana and Zenyatta. Now, you'll notice I left out a whole bunch of characters, and that's for two different reasons. Either because the characters themselves aren't really that good, or because the hero requires a fairly high skill to play them effectively. And that brings us into the next one. Number 3. Strong heroes are not always strong picks. As I mentioned, there are some characters that require a high level of skill in order to play effectively. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't try to play these characters because they can be very powerful, but you have to understand they are meant for higher skill players, and if you aren't at that level yet, using these characters can actually be a detriment to your team. The characters specifically that I'm talking about are Genji, McCree, Tracer, Hanzo, Widowmaker, and Ana. Genji and Tracer require a player able to fully utilize their mobility. McCree, Hanzo, Widowmaker, and Ana require a player with a high level of accuracy. The example I always like to use when trying to explain this situation is with McCree. He can do a lot of damage, particularly the headshots. With his left click, it's 70 damage per hit and 140 per headshot. When a new player looks at that, they'll think, wow, that is an incredible amount of damage for a single left click. And they would be right, provided that the player is actually able to consistently land headshots. If you have very good accuracy, you can land a lot of those 140 damage hits. But low and middle bracket players aren't going to do that. They're going to miss a lot more often. So they aren't going to be doing 140 damage per hit. Instead, they're going to be doing 0 damage because they're going to keep missing. The characters I mentioned can be very powerful, but only if you're good enough to actually use them effectively. In the meantime, you should try using other characters that are a little bit more forgiving, namely the ones I mentioned in the previous tip. Get good at those first, then move on to the more difficult characters. Number 2, don't get stuck on a main. In case you don't know, when someone says a hero is their main, it means that the player will almost exclusively use that one hero, or at the very least, they will try to use that hero as much as they possibly can. This is really bad for a few reasons. Because the player has devoted nearly all his time to learning only one character, if that hero is taken by somebody else, he's going to have a lot more difficulty being useful with any other character. Additionally, the player will not be able to switch off if the enemy team is running heroes that will counter his main. I've seen quite a few people who insist on using only one character all the time, and these players usually end up getting destroyed because of it, which in turn can cause their team to lose the match. You aren't going to be an expert with every character, but you should try to be equally good with at least 3 heroes. That way, if someone else is using one of them, or if the enemy team is running a counter, you can switch off and still be useful in the match. And the number 1 tip is know the counter picks. Overwatch is meant to be a big game of rock, paper, scissors, where each hero is strong against some and weak against others. Now, it isn't a perfect system because some heroes have a lot more counters than others, but the general idea is still there. It's important to know what these matchups are, what heroes are good versus others. A couple of quick examples are if the enemy team is running a Winston. If you wanted to counter that, your team could run a Reaper, Roadhog, or a Diva. The enemy Winston would then have to either deal with playing in a bad situation, or he would be forced to switch to another character. On the other hand, if you're playing a character and the enemy team switches, you may want to consider switching as well depending on how effective you're still able to be. If you're playing Pharah and the enemy team has a Soldier or a McCree, you may have to switch to something else if they keep shooting you out of the sky. But if they're having a hard time and they're not landing their shots and you can stay in the air and continue to be effective, then you don't need to switch. If you get killed several times in a row without actually doing anything, it's probably a good idea to switch off. This kind of goes along with the last point that I made about how you shouldn't really have a single character that you specialize in. Because when the situation inevitably arises where the enemy team has several heroes that are able to counter the one you're playing, you need to be able to switch to something else. Now, I can't really go over the entire list of counter picks because that would be a whole video by itself. But if you want to learn more, you can simply do a search on Google for Overwatch counter picks and you will have a huge list of articles, images, and other information on what heroes counter who. Again, if you notice after a couple of deaths that you're not really being that effective, you should stop for a second and look at what the enemy team is currently using, and see if there's anything you can switch to that might make the situation better. Alright guys, that is it for this one. I'm always uploading the latest in tips, guides, and Overwatch news, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of it. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, share it with your friends. Thank you very much for watching. Remember, always blame the controller because it's never your fault.